All right, hello. Welcome back. You guys are doing good. Just gonna start off in about 5 minutes or so. Thanks everybody for being here, and hope you're just comfortable and having a good day so far. Hey there, hi Gary, hi Rachel, Cameron. Hey there, hi Gary. Sorry, let me have it running on my phone too, so I gotta silence that so there's no weird feedback loop. I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm having a pretty good day so far. Just been grading and taking care of some of my duties here. Hello, Ricardo. Good evening to you too. Lakers game 1, yeah. It's a wrap. It's not going to be nothing. It's got to be a sweep. And nobody should be surprised. LeBron James is the greatest NBA player of all time. I don't want to hear nothing about Michael Jordan. I want to hear nothing about Kobe Bryant. I'm sorry. I'm laying the gauntlet down. LeBron James is the greatest basketball player on this earth, on this planet, in this universe. Period. Done. Yeah, Lakers in 4. Hello, hi guys. It's unbelievable what he's done in the league. And you know what? He's going to be going out for another 10 years. This guy's going to play till 45, and I don't know what's going to stop him. The only thing that's going to stop him is time. But for now, he's just dominant. Everybody needs to respect LeBron James. I hate all those haters that be out there yeah, oh, LeBron James is a baby. He's passive aggressive. Oh, he passes too much. Man, get out of here. LeBron James, this is a masterpiece of basketball. We're looking at like Beethoven, Michelangelo type. You know what I mean? Anyway, I could talk about this. Oh yeah, he will play with his son. I'm sure about that. Definitely no. The guy's passing, it's everything. I mean, he's going to be the leading scorer of all time, and he's not even really focused on that. I mean, it's stupid how good he is. And he doesn't get enough respect. As good as he is, how is it that people still talk trash, man? 10 finals. He's been in the finals every year since 2011, except last year. Look at that run. People say, oh, he lost a lot of times in the NBA Finals. Okay, well, he was not the favorite in those times that he lost. The only time he was the favorite that they lost was back in 2011 against Dallas. His second finals appearance, but the first with the Heat. So there's really no debate. People have opinions. There's no debate, though. One second. There's just a couple more minutes, and then at 5:30 we'll get started. I replace this light bulb for the chandelier right here. All right. Hey guys. All right, cool. There's a chandelier right here. One of the light bulbs just went out, and I had to put it back in. So, Yeah, it's full light. Okay, good evening, everybody. Just a few seconds here. All right, everybody, it's 5:30. See all you guys in the chat. It's good to see you again. So today our goal is to pretty much finish off the last couple of little things in the work of Immanuel Kant. And then we have another essay to follow, which is all about economic inequality. And the question is, do we have any type of moral obligation to assist the global poor? Do we have such an obligation or not? There are different views on that question. And we're going to take both sides of that argument before we're done with this part of the class. But before I jump into that next author on the topic of economic inequality, the haves and the have-nots, I'm going to get us started by just wrapping up the work of Kant one time. Okay, so let's just go back and refresh our memory about his work. Kant is another one of the big moral philosophers of Western history. And his system of ethics is a lot different from the work of John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill was a utilitarian, and as you guys now know, that whole idea is that you should take the action that creates the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. Why does he say that we should do that? Because happiness is the only thing that each of us seeks as a goal and not as a means. And if it's the goal of each person's behavior and activity, then why not make the maximization of it the standard of ethics? Now, we talked about objections to his theory and on and on. We also talked about how to apply it to specific scenarios. Then we turn the page to Kant. So Kant has a way different way of looking at ethics. He doesn't say that we should try to promote the most overall happiness. In fact, he says that consequences and outcomes are not the thing that determines the morality of an action. What is? Instead, it's the will, it's the intention that one has when they do the action. So if you act with a good will, that's all that you're morally obligated to do. And the consequences don't matter whether they play out favorably or unfavorably. The only thing that's morally evaluated is the nature of the person's will when they do the action. Now, from there we get pushed to the next point in his analysis. What is a good will? He says that a good will is when you act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. And when you act from the motive of duty, your action has moral worth, but it's only when it's done from that motive that it has moral worth. If it's done from the motive of inclination, as he says, then it lacks moral worth. The motive of inclination is just wanting to do something because you desire to do it or because it pleases you. In the shopkeeper example, we are given this scenario where a shopkeeper could give a fair price or an unfair price to a young child. Now, if he gives him the fair price but does not want to, then he's doing it not from inclination, the fair price, but rather out of a sense of duty. He's disinclined in that version of it to do the right thing, but he forces himself to do it despite his disinclination because he knows that's what the moral law commands him to do. If he does give the fair price, but just because it pleases him, or because he's afraid of losing some advantage against other vendors, then he's doing it not because of the motive of duty, but just because he desires to for some other pleasure-seeking reason. And in that case, the act ceases to have moral value. Let me read actually a little quote from his chapter here, and you can hear how he talks about this so-called shopkeeper example. He says on page 107, so he says, I here omit all actions already recognized as contrary to duty, even though they may be useful for this or that end, because in the case of these, the question does not arise at all as to whether they might be done from duty, since they conflict with duty. I also set aside actions which are in accordance with duty, yet to which men have no immediate inclination, but perform them because they are impelled thereto by some other inclination, because in the second case, to decide whether the action which accords with duty has been done from duty or from a selfish purpose is easy. The difference is more difficult to note in a third case where an action accords with duty, and the subject has, in addition, an immediate inclination to do the action. Now, for example, that a dealer should not overcharge an inexperienced purchaser certainly accords with duty, And where there is much commerce, the prudent merchant does not overcharge, but keeps to a fixed price for everyone in general, so that a child may buy from him just as well as everyone else may. Thus, customers are honestly served. But this is not nearly enough for making us believe that the merchant has acted this way from duty and from principles of honesty. His own advantage required him to do it. He cannot, however, be assumed to have in addition an immediate inclination toward the buyer, causing him, as it were, out of love, to give him the fair price. Hence, the action was done neither from duty nor from inclination, but from a selfish purpose. Okay, so just some summary along with reference to the text. After the whole discussion of acting from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law, that's what a good will is, the final remaining point is, well, what's the moral law and how do we unveil what it is or learn what it is? Kant said that by the use of reason, we can come to understand what the moral law dictates that we must do and must not do. And the principle that he presents, that we use our reason to judge the morality of an action on, is called the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative, there are two versions of it. I talked to you guys at the end of the meeting last time about the first version. The first version, you may remember, says what? That act always, so that the maxim which describes your action could be willed to be a universal law. Okay? So just a reminder, maxims are the person's individual principle of action. It sort of sounds something like, I will do X in circumstances C. The question that Kant raises is, if you imagine that maxim to be a universal law such that all people do X in circumstances C, would that be possible? Or would that be undesirable? If the universalized action would both be possible and not undesirable, then it's permissible to do that for yourself. But if you imagine your principle of action not being possible for all to do, or even being undesirable for all to do, then it's wrong to do that, and you shouldn't do it either. One example of this, I know we talked about the long line, we talked about the free rider on the subway. I'm not sure if we mentioned the example of a person who wants to request a loan, but deliberately does not want to pay it back, so they're going to lie about their intentions of repayment just to get the loan given, and then they will make sure not to pay it back. So in that case, the person's maxim is, I will make a false promise of repayment when I want money. If that became a universal law, it would be that all people make false promises of repayment when they request loans. But if that were so, then there would no longer be any lending, because all lenders would know that 100%, not just one or two people, but 100% of people lie and default on their promises to repay. So the person who's making this lying promise wants there to be a presumption of honesty that exists when lenders request the loans. But such presumption wouldn't exist if everybody did what they're doing. So they're doing something wrong. And I'll read also from Kant on that, so you can again hear from the author. Here's the way he put that point, and the whole example of the false promise to repay. It says here on page 109, in the right column of 109, it says, a man in need finds himself forced to borrow money. He knows well that he won't be able to repay it, but he sees that he will not get a loan unless he firmly promises to repay it within a fixed amount of time. He wants to make that promise, but he still has conscience enough to ask himself whether it is not permissible and is contrary to duty to get out of difficulty in this way. Suppose, however, that he decides to do that. The maxim of his action would then be expressed as follows. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, although I know that I can never do so. Now, this principle of self-love or personal advantage may perhaps be quite compatible with his future welfare, but the question is now whether it is right. So I transformed the requirement into a universal law and put the question thus: how would things stand if this maxim were to become a universal law? You then see at once that such a maxim could never hold as a universal law of nature and be consistent with itself, but must necessarily be self-contradictory. Because the universality of a law which says that anyone believing himself to be in difficulty could promise whatever they like with the intention of not keeping it would make promising itself and the goal to be achieved by it impossible, since no one would believe what was promised them, but would merely laugh at all such utterances as being vain pretenses. So, maybe his old-time way of putting it, but you hear the point yet again. So I said, though, that there's a second version of the categorical imperative, too. There are two versions of it. So we've just gone over the summary of version 1. But now, to close our whole discussion of Kant, we've got to briefly touch on that second version, okay? So here we go, categorical imperative version 2. And this is still closing our lectures on Kant. Okay, version 2 of the categorical imperative. Here's what it says. It's a little simpler and more straightforward, I guess, than the first one. What it says is, never treat a human being as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself. So here we go. Never treat a human being as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself. So a second look at the categorical imperative expressed in this alternative formulation. And what you see written there is this: never treat a human being as a means to an end, but instead always treat human beings as though they are the end for which you are acting. So let's go back to an earlier discussion we had, because we actually discussed means and ends when we went over the work of John Stuart Mill, when he says that happiness or pleasure is the only thing that all human beings pursue as an end and not as a means. That required us to go over those terms. So help me in the chat then, somebody. What's an end again? In other words, the definition of the word end. What is an end in the usage that we're looking at here? Who could tell me that one? Well, sort of, Gary, but more can be said. It is a result, but it's a desired result. So what do you call a result that you want to have happen? It's a goal. That's correct. It's a goal. So, yes. But again, Gary, consequence is a little bit too minimalist. Consequences can happen that you don't want. Results can happen that you don't want. An end is an intended result or consequence. So it's a goal or an objective. Brooklyn, the word happiness is what Mill thought the end of all human activity is. But I'm just asking you now to forget about Mill for a minute. I just wanted to bring back on the table the words end and mean itself. So an end is a goal. What are the means then again? Who remembers that part? Ends are goals or objectives. What are the means in comparison to the ends? The means are, let's hear it, the steps taken and the process that you take, actions that you take to do what? The process or the steps, I think you know. The steps of the process, the actions that you take to get to the goal. Okay, so like for example, maybe you have a goal of being, of having a nice career. And if you do have that goal, then I think one way you're trying to get there is to graduate college. And so college and graduation is a means to further goals that you have set. So anyway, whenever you have a goal, we could call it an end. And whatever you're going to do to get there will be called the means. Now going back to this, what it says then in other words is that when you are dealing with other human beings like yourself, one of us, a fellow member of our human race, when you're dealing with another member of humanity, you're supposed to treat the human being not as though they are a means towards some goal that you have. So people are not supposed to be treated as instruments to be manipulated towards the achievement of some goal that you've set. Instead, human beings have such dignity and they deserve such respect that you have to treat human beings as though they are the goal for the sake of which you are acting. Never a means, always an end. Okay, so what this forbids people from doing, according to the principle, is all manner of manipulation, force, fraud, or exploitation that would use another person in a way they would not approve of to get to some goal that you've set for yourself. Okay? So like, I don't know, let me give you examples of how this would be violated. I'm at a wealthy person's house, and it's like a big social gathering, and I'm by myself. I excuse myself to the bathroom. I notice a little room that nobody's in. When I go in there, there's like some very valuable items. And let's say I steal one of those things from him that he owns, and I take it with me and I leave and I sell it on the black market for a bunch of money for me. Now in that case, my goal was my self-enrichment. But I used the person's property and wealth as a means to that end, and therefore I did do something wrong. I didn't give the person the opportunity or choice to choose whether or not they consent to their part in the interaction. I merely took the item without their consent, and that's theft, and the reason that it's wrong is because it uses the victim of theft as a means to the end of attaining whatever was stolen. If a person's raped, I mean, that's a horrible thing, but if a person's raped then that's a very vivid case as well. The person's body is used as a means to the end of whatever gratification that the perpetrator will try to derive from the act, as perverse as that is. And so in that case, again, the person's will is bypassed by definition of the act. They've not consented, and so you're using them and their body as a means to an end that they don't approve of. But people are not means. People are not things or objects to be used for the attainment of goals that you have that they don't share. They're to be treated with respect rationally, so as ends, not as means. Here's a weird case. Suppose there was like a big mass casualty shooting going on. I mean, nowadays these things are probably harder for people to do because we're all locked away in our houses. But suppose that you're in a big public place and some shooter's out there. Oops, they're killing people, and that's horrible. Now, suppose that in the midst of all that chaotic mess, everyone's rushing away, trying to scatter to safety and get the hell out of there. But suppose that during that chaos and confusion, one person in the scene who's even bigger and stronger than you, let's just pretend, they come up behind you, they grab your body, hold it tight in front of them, and then they move through the scene holding your body like this. Now I'm trying to describe the person using you as a human shield. Why? Because they're scared of getting shot or something, so they want to have a barrier between them and any incoming bullets. But they're using you, a human being, as the human shield. Now, is that okay? Is that morally permissible, or is it wrong? It's definitely wrong. And you would know that. You'd know if that was done to you, that you're being treated immorally because you're not a shield, you're not a table, you're not an object, you're a subject. You've got your own rational will, and therefore you're being treated as a thing instead of a person. So these are extreme examples, but any situation that involves another person in an interaction they would not consent to uses that person as a means. So there was a little companion piece to the Kant, I think, that I listed in our syllabus, which was the writing of Honora O'Neill. I didn't spend much time, and I'm not going to spend much time on that because she doesn't add much, but there's one thing in her paper that I wanted to throw on the board. What she's doing in her essay is she calls it a simplified account of Kant's ethics. Her goal in writing that paper was to try and bring down to earth some of the heady, somewhat complex ideas of Kant so that any ordinary person could quickly understand it. And she thinks the easiest way to approach Kant and to understand the basics of his ideas is to think about the second version of the categorical imperative. As she sees it, it's really saying something that can be easily understood, which is you use someone as a means when you involve them in an interaction that they would not consent to. So I'm going to put that on the board, and that's the little contribution of O'Neill to the analysis of Kant. So this is still the categorical imperative here, but the principle O'Neill provides is this. You treat someone as a means. So what are you not supposed to do? This. You treat someone as a means when you involve them in an interaction that they would not consent to. Okay, so if I mug somebody and I steal their wallet, I've interacted with them in a way that they don't consent to. That's not like a person saying, hey, come over here and take my wallet and it's yours. That would be different. That would not be impermissible because then their rational will has authorized the transfer of the wealth or property to me. But if I bypass their will, then I'm just using them to get something that I want, and I'm not even treating them like a person. So respect humanity is the point. We're all human beings, and we're all rational creatures. The rationality that other human beings has deserves and demands respect. It's the same respect that you want people to show you, right? You don't want to be treated as just like an object to be used for other people's purposes that you don't share with them. So because that's the treatment that you deserve, it's the same treatment that you should show to others who are also members of the human race like you are. So don't involve people in interactions that they would not consent to. And if you don't do that, then you are safe as far as Kant's moral philosophy is concerned. Now, why are two versions of the principle? Kant and the scholars that have analyzed all his work over the years seem to agree that although there are two versions of the principle, they both lead to the same outcome in every case. So basically, anything that's wrong according to version 1 is also wrong according to version 2. And anything that's permitted by one of those two versions is also permitted by the other. So what I'm telling you is that any action that's based on a bad maxim that could not be made universal also inevitably involves using some person as a means. And any time when one is used as a means, that also inevitably involves a maxim that could not be made into a universal law. So if they both say the same thing, why have two instead of one? I've heard it argued that the difference between them makes it easier to use one or the other depending on the situation you're in. So when the interaction with the other person or persons is more direct and immediate, you might think along the lines of version 2. When the interaction with other people is less direct, is indirect, then you might think more along the lines of the first one about maxims and universal laws. So like, when I take the free, when I ride for free on the subway, and I'm doing something that cannot be made universal with the subway still existing, that also treats people as a means, but it's a little harder to understand how that does, because you're just alone jumping on the subway for free, right? Jumping the turnstile. How does that use others as a means? Well, it does, because it exploits everyone else who follows the rule and pays the fare so that you can ride for free using the service that they're funding. So it treats their fidelity to the rules as a means to the end you have of free ridership. So it takes a few steps sometimes to see how an act based on a bad maxim uses some person known or unknown as a means, but it does. So whether you think along the lines of version 1 or 2, that's Kant's categorical imperative, and that's the thing that ties together all the other parts of his ethics. So act from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law, and the moral law is dictated to you by reason. It's discoverable by reason by thinking of the categorical imperative in either of its two versions. So just go into the world, make sure that you don't intend to use anybody in a way that they would not agree with, and make sure that you don't intentionally take actions that could not be made into universal laws or standards. Now here's another thing. Some people hear this account of Kant, that it's wrong to use people as a means, and they misunderstand what that implies. Like some people think, well, does that mean that if I go to a tutor, that's bad because I'm kind of using the tutor for my improvement in my grades and my classes, and that's my goal, I'm just using them for that? Is that wrong? No, no, no. There's a difference there, and it has to do with the point here. Why is it that that's not wrong? That case, where the person is useful to you, but they're not being used as a means. What's the factor that makes the tutor example morally permitted? Why do you think? Because they consent, right? They choose their part within the interaction. They're not being forced against their will to give you tutelage. They're not being held like hostage so that you can gain this knowledge. They're compensated. They know what they're doing. They've undertaken that deliberately on their own initiative. And if they don't want to be a tutor, then they can simply freely choose to no longer do that. So an interaction with another person that's mutually beneficial to one or both, that's either beneficial or mutually beneficial, is going to be permitted as long as the other individual consents under full information to their role in the interaction. So like, consensual sex between people, I mean, that would be morally permitted, at least according to one way of looking at Kant, because it's consented to on both sides, even though they're getting something out of it. If I buy a coffee from like a barista at Starbucks, and they make the drink for me, and then I walk out happy to have my drink, they have not been used as a means, because the employment is something that they freely undertake, and they know that they could choose to no longer work if they didn't want to have the duties associated with their job. Okay, so just a little clarification. I don't want anybody to think that Kant is saying don't ever, like no one can help each other or something. That's not the point. It's interactions that advance a goal of yours, but without the rational consent of the other individual or individuals in that interaction. Okay, so we can finish then the Kant. That's all that I wanted to say. We capped it off now. For the rest of today, I'm going to try and help you guys understand a new article. So as we move to the next part of the class, we have a few meetings now devoted to an ethical issue in our world. So the first thing I wanted to do is just try and show you guys what are some ethical theories, which provide just parameters and principles, ground rules, for classifying acts as moral or immoral. But it gets a little interesting when you then try to utilize those theories to make moral judgments about real-world issues and moral problems. And so there's a lot of moral problems. In a Philosophy 320 class, which maybe some of you will take, I don't know, someday. We offer it here at our school, but that's contemporary moral problems. And in a class like that, sometimes I teach it here, not next semester, but in the past I have. And it's like you'll learn about the ethical debates concerning abortion, the morality of war, genetic engineering, human cloning, death penalty. So there's a lot of controversial moral issues that people do disagree on and debate. The one, though, in our book that I've chosen for us to focus on is this question: do we have a moral obligation to assist the global poor? Do citizens of the first world living in industrialized nations like us, relatively affluent, do we have any moral obligation to assist financially or otherwise the global poor that are starving in the third world? Now, not everyone agrees on the answer to this question. Some argue that we do have a moral obligation to do that, but there are others who say no. And we're going to take a look at both perspectives on that. So we're starting with Peter Singer, who makes the case that we do have this moral obligation to assist the poor. And then after we finish with him, time provided, I think we'll get to it. We'll talk about Garrett Hardin. And Garrett Hardin says no. To the contrary, we don't have a moral obligation to assist the poor. And as he argues, it's actually, he thinks it's counterproductive even to the goal of alleviating global poverty and hunger. So two different, completely opposed arguments, and that's just the way philosophy always is. We learned in our studies in philosophy of religion that there are arguments and counter-arguments. So everything gets challenged rationally through argument in philosophy, but we got to start somewhere. So let's start with Peter Singer now. So Peter Singer was born in 1946, and he's still alive today. You can email him anytime and just say hello, but he's one of the big living philosophers that's out there right now. He's an Australian philosopher, but he's taught at some very elite institutions here and elsewhere, Princeton for a long time. He is one of the most famous living ethicists, moral philosophers. Back in the 70s, when he was still pretty young, academic, he wrote a book that has become kind of a classic book, which is called Animal Liberation. That book makes this long, detailed argument for moral vegetarianism. And that is kind of an interesting book because it was written in the 70s when the whole, the trend around vegetarianism really didn't exist. It's become much more, I think, kind of common or popular today. And he's one of, I guess, the sort of trailblazers of that whole moral argument that's led to more attention on vegetarianism or even veganism. So Peter Singer is a well-known author, but he's also got a lot of interesting articles on every number of other topics, including this one, which is the rich and the poor. So this article we're looking at is from 1993, and it's just called Rich and Poor. And as I said, just to repeat again, he's making an argument in this paper here, this essay, that we, members of the first world, have got some type of moral obligation to assist the third world global poor. So let me take you on a little tour through his argument here. Now, to begin, he just hits us with some basic empirical facts and figures about poverty. So there's a lot of people in this world right now that are so poor that they're starving to death, that they can't get enough food to survive, or at least not to survive very well or for very long. And estimates vary, but it's upwards of 1 billion people in the world who lack the basic food and nutrition needed to just sustain their baseline physical and mental health. If you're living in a part of the third world where this kind of poverty prevails, you're going to be hungry all the time, and you're going to be fighting off starvation. Not just that, but there's going to be probably poor public sanitation, a lot of opportunistic diseases and infections flying around, low literacy, so people are also not, in every case, perfectly well informed about the protocols that should be taken to try and relieve some of those problems. So it's a difficult way to live in absolute poverty. And sometimes people feel like, I've noticed that different people have different attitudes, but some people, it's like they don't have a soft spot for the poor. They don't feel much sympathy for the poor. Some people just think, oh, it must have been some kind of fault of the individual or of their society or something. But it's hard to feel that kind of callous about the children that are poor and starving, because obviously children are just born into this world. They've got no ability to determine what country they're born in or what the situation is there. And a lot of children each year die from starvation too. In the time of his writing this, it's 14 million a year. And although the global population is a lot bigger now, it's probably still about that number because it's stabilized a little bit in the 90s and 2000s, but we have so many more people now, so that figure is still relatively accurate. So a lot of people dying of starvation, including children. And we in the industrialized first world, we don't get to see the full scale of human poverty. If we want to go out and try and look at poverty in our country, in our society, the closest approach you're going to have to like the extremity of global poverty in the third world is going to be like, you know, the homeless and stuff in some of our inner cities. But even taking the case of the homeless, as bad as that is, and as much of a problem as that is, the conditions that American homeless people live in is relatively abundant in comparison to the third world poor. If you've ever had a chance to watch some documentary footage and you see some of the conditions that exist in poor parts of the world, sometimes people are walking around looking like straight skeletons, buzzards and flies flying around like ready to prey on them almost. And so in America anyway, no matter how poor you are, there's so much surplus wealth and social assistance programs that even just panhandling and getting some type of meager government support is still enough to maintain a person's like a full frame body. So it's not to say that there's no problem with poverty here. Of course there is, but there's levels to it. And the poverty that we experience and see in our own communities and in our own countries, just not really on the same level as what you'd find in like the plains of West Africa or other parts of the globe. Now there's a phrase that was coined to kind of define this condition of poverty. This is a phrase that's borrowed from the former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and Peter Singer mentions this, which is the term absolute poverty. So let me, I'll erase the title and stuff, and let's talk about absolute poverty. Okay, so absolute poverty is basically not having enough income or wealth to meet the very fundamental human needs of food, clothing, and shelter. So poverty from any sense of basic human needs. So not having enough income or wealth to meet the basic human needs of three things. Food, clothing, and shelter. All right, and so that's the kind of poverty we're talking about, that even having devoted all of the money you make or whatever wealth that you manage to save to your basic needs, you have nothing left over or not even enough to fund those things. So these are not things that are like optional. These are not just luxuries or something. Food, clothing, and shelter. You can't just be like, I'm going to save money, so I'm going to stop paying rent, I'm going to stop eating, and I'm just not going to have any clothes. Obviously, those are fundamental baseline human needs. It's hard to survive without those things, obviously. And so when you think of absolute poverty, you're thinking of people living in a severely degraded set of conditions and just struggling to survive. How many people in the world live in absolute poverty? Well, as I said, the numbers, the various estimates can be somewhat different, but even a conservative estimate would have it over 1 billion. And this is in the year 1993. So he gives the figure 1.2 billion. In the year 2020, with the global population substantially larger, this number is for sure bigger than that in the current day. And I think there's something on the order of 6.5, 7 billion people alive right now. So this is a substantial percentage of the whole global human race. So there's a lot of people suffering and struggling in absolute poverty. Why does he call it absolute poverty? Well, because there's also poverty in the relative sense. And some of us might sometimes look at people living on the mansion on the hill and say, I feel like I'm poor compared to them. And sure enough, you probably are. That's a fair judgment. But the thing is, this is poverty from any baseline assessment of essential human needs. So not like poverty in the relative sense, but in the absolute sense. So absolute poverty kills people, causes them to starve, die. It makes lives miserable and short, even when the person's still alive, and it kills people of all ages, genders and everything in between. Now, Peter Singer, the philosopher writing this stuff and talking about it, is a utilitarian in his moral philosophy. So we've learned about utilitarianism, and what you now know is that means he believes the right action is always whatever creates the most happiness for the greatest number. And since absolute poverty is making people's lives short and killing people and making them miserable, it seems like it's a huge counterweight to overall human happiness on the planet Earth. So he thinks that any person with a utilitarian set of principles should be somewhat motivated to try and improve on the situation and remedy it in some way to reduce the overall level of pain and suffering and to create more overall human happiness for the world. So this is a major, maybe even primary source of human misery and pain. Now, we've talked a lot in this class about like, weird hypothetical scenarios. In philosophy, that's important because oftentimes we need to get a situation in your mind so that you can contemplate certain concepts or ideas when an argument's being presented. So like, we talk about, oh, imagine there's, this perfect island, or imagine there's a hidden emperor, imagine a guy's walking through the forest, he sees a sphere. So those hypothetical examples are important in philosophy, but I understand sometimes people getting their feet wet, learning this stuff the first time, they might be a little bit frustrated by that, like, oh, isn't that a little bit hyper unrealistic or detached from the real world? But anyway, that's not my reaction. I love it all. But, if you have that feeling, or if anybody ever did, well, at least in this case of Peter Singer's paper and his discussion, this is not at all anything hypothetical. This is a real-world situation on the planet right now. It's something that doesn't always make headlines, in our domestic news media, because we seem to be more preoccupied here with the affairs going on in our own country, political stuff, celebrity gossip, sports. But just don't assume that everything's going well in the world when there's no domestic scandal or catastrophe happening here, because this global poverty that we're talking about, it's always in the background. It's not something that takes a break, like the weather was bad for a week and then it comes back and it's good again. This is just a persistent condition that's in the world, and the only reason we don't see more of it is because it's not necessarily served up to us in our media consumption. Now, the problem of this global hunger, according to Peter Singer, he wants to make a point here. He says it's not a problem of scarcity of resources. Instead, it's a problem of waste and inefficient use and distribution of the available resources. So let me put that point here and I'll explain what he means. So all I've said here and what he says is that the problem of global hunger is not a problem of scarcity of resources, instead, it is a problem of waste and poor distribution of resources. Okay, so let me try to explain what he's going for here. He knows that at this juncture of his presentation that some person might think, but there's nothing you can do though. It's just futile to try and even talk about or address this problem. Some people will say that. They'll say it's inevitably never going to be fixed because we have too many people and not enough consumable resources. So if you have a big burgeoning global population, kind of out of control population growth around the world, and not enough food for everybody, then basically some people are just not going to get enough to eat. Have you ever heard of the old game musical chairs? Maybe some people played that back in their day. With musical chairs, it's just an analogy, right? But in musical chairs, the music plays, people walk around the set of chairs, and when the music stops, everyone's got to try to take a seat. But the whole point is that there's not enough seats for everybody, so the last one to get seated they lose. So if you have too many people and not enough seats, then not everyone's going to get a seat at the table, basically. In a similar way, if you argue there's too many people in the world for all the food that we have, and there's just more people than there is food, then inevitably some people just won't get to have enough. Now, that would be if it was a problem of scarcity, that there's literally not enough food for everybody, so you just can't really do anything about it. But he's denying that. He says it's actually not about scarcity. That means there would be enough food for the whole global population and we could eliminate hunger. But the problem is more having to do with the fact that we waste a lot of our food and that we also poorly and inefficiently distribute the food that we could produce. Okay, so point about waste, first of all. We in the West, and especially in the United States, where we have a very heavy consumer culture, there's a lot of waste. We let a lot of things go spoil. A lot of food goes into the waste basket, into the landfill. Sometimes we order more than we really are going to eat. And so if we had just a little bit more of a kind of frugal attitude towards how much we buy versus how much we consume food-wise, then that would have so much savings that could make a large, substantial dent in the problem of global hunger on its own. The second point, though, has to do with inefficient distribution of the resources of food. And by that, he's referring to something that's actually been studied a lot, which is that since we have a very heavy reliance on animal agriculture and meat-based diet, meat is like a staple of Western diet and for sure American diet, we cause a lot of food to be wasted by diverting consumable resources to the cows and livestock that we then turn into meat for market consumption. It's been discovered that, in fact, the amount of consumable resources that have to be diverted to an animal results in a loss of efficiency in terms of how many consumable resources could have been directly given to human beings. So essentially the point here is that if fewer of us ate meat, or if we kind of modified that centrality of it in our diet, that would result in so much savings of food overall that could actually provide enough for an even larger global population than we have now. Now, it might not surprise you that a guy named Peter Singer, who wrote Animal Liberation, would make that argument, right? But don't misunderstand him. He's not saying, let's just advocate for a global conversion to like mass conversion to vegetarianism and save the world hunger problem that way, because he knows that's not realistic. But he wants to make the point that this shows something, that theoretically, it's not that it's impossible to get all the food that's necessary for everyone in the world. It's just that we make choices individually and collectively as a society that produce waste and inefficiency. So he thinks we cannot excuse inaction. We cannot console ourselves by saying, yeah, there's a problem, but if we can't do anything about it, just let's forget about it. So he says there are possibilities of making an improvement on the situation. So next point is to talk a little bit about the other side of this coin. He's spoken of absolute poverty, but what about wealth? That brings us to the definition of absolute affluence, which is essentially what all of us are living in according to the way it's defined. So absolute affluence. Okay, so absolute affluence, that is having, it's basically just the reverse, the contrapositive of the other definition, having more than enough income and wealth to meet the same basic needs that we talk about, food, clothing, and shelter. All right, that's absolute affluence, having money and wealth in abundance, beyond what's necessary to secure your baseline necessities. So according to this definition, each of us is living in absolute affluence, meaning that after you have spent your whatever income and wealth you have on the basics, food, place to sleep at night, and some clothes on your back, all of us, each of us still has money left over to buy other things that are non-essential things, like luxury items, entertainment. We used to go to concerts and stuff, but there's all kinds of stuff that we do for fun that is not an essential expense, and we have the additional wealth beyond the basic necessities to do that. So we buy new outfits, we buy technology, and on and on and on, travel, or whatever the case may be. So we live in absolute affluence, meaning we have income beyond necessity. But now flipping back again to the case of the absolute poor, he refers us to this statistic, which is quite shocking, that the people living in absolute poverty, over 1 billion people in the world, are living with an average per capita income of $200. So let me make the point with this note. Over 1 billion people live on $200 per capita income. Okay, now let me explain that statement. the condition of the people living in absolute poverty is very, very dire, such that we're talking about $200 annual income. That's per capita income. Now, this was written in 1993. Today it's 2020. So to be fair, if we include the rate of inflation, then to update that figure, let's say it could be a factor of 2. But still, that's pretty meager. We're coming close to 2021, finally. But anyway, what if I told you that your budget, your allowance for 2021, it's not going to be good. You're going to get $400. That's what you got to make stretch for the whole 365-day year next year. Now, if that was really what you had to do, it'd be tough sledding, right? What you'd have to do is what people in the third world actually do, which is pool together in like big communal living situations, family collectives, extended family members. Everyone pools together the meager income and labor that they can contribute so that now we can purchase like surplus amounts of cheap consumable products that can be rationed off, like grain or other sources of nutrition. That would be a tough way to live, but that's the way it really is for a billion people plus on the planet Earth. So he says, looking at these disparities, the haves and the have-nots, we're in the have situation, talking about the have-nots on the other side. He thinks, why wouldn't we be willing to make some improvement on the situation by diverting some of the surplus wealth that we have to the cause of global poverty reduction? And if we did that, he says, either individually or as a society, if we did more of that, we could afford to do it, and it wouldn't even undermine our own well-being in any significant way, such as our affluence. And so what is being transferred to the third world from the first world towards this cause? He says the numbers are kind of disappointing. So let me walk you through the statistics that he gives. So again, keep in mind that this writing is from 1993, not ancient history or anything, but some of the numbers might be slightly different today. You can look up current figures if you like, but I'm just teaching you this article. Anyway, the United Nations had a target goal which was set of 0.7% of gross domestic product for the wealthy industrialized nations to devote to a kind of joint fund that would then be available for poverty reduction and hunger reduction efforts. So that was the UN target goal. UN, United Nations, said, can we try to get these member nations that are wealthy to give 0.7% of their gross domestic product economic output? That's an achievable goal, the figure of 0.7. But what was actually given by some of the biggest nations compared to that goal, and the numbers he provides are not necessarily impressive. So I'm looking at it here. So as he says here, at present very little is being transferred. Only a few countries, Sweden, Netherlands, Norway, some of the oil exporting Arab states have reached the modest goal. But let's talk about some of our big allies and us ourselves. Britain, 0.31%. So that's the UK. That's less than half of the target. Japan, 0.32, right around the same. Germany, little more, 0.41. And then we get to the United States with all of our wealth, the wealthiest nation of all, not necessarily the most generous on this score, because the figure, at least as his writing was done, is 0.15. So one of the most meager contributions of all from the nation with the most wealth to expend. So look, having said all that, he gets to this kind of tough proposition. He poses this question. Is there a difference between not providing help to people who are going to die if they don't get it, and really just killing people? Is there any moral equivalence at all between the characteristic of a killer and those who fail to assist? Now, he knows that those are not quite exactly the same. So he just teases that question out. But I'm sure you and I can all agree that we would not like ourselves, because we're all in the category which is subject to the critique that he's making. We probably hesitate and balk at the characterization that we are somehow comparable to the moral characteristic of like one who would kill. But if there are differences between killing and the failure to assist, what are the differences? And that's the next part of his essay that he launches into. So he next provides us with a quick rundown of what could be claimed as differences between killing and failing to assist. The reason he's pointing these out is to give voice to his critics who are going to say they're very different, killing and failing to assist. But after he provides those differences, he's going to go back over them and try to make the case that although they show that killing is worse than failing to assist, it's worse, it doesn't remove all the moral blame from failure to assist. There's still something significantly wrong with it, he thinks, even if he will concede the point ultimately that it's not on the same quite moral level as killing would be. But let's talk about that. The differences mentioned by the author Singer between killing and the failure to assist. Okay. Okay, so I think he has five differences that he wants to mention for us. So hold on one second. I don't know if that provides like slight more lighting, but I have another lamp over there, so maybe that helps just a bit. I think it was getting a bit dim. Okay, so differences between killing and failing to assist. Number one, different motivation. All right, difference of motivation. So let's talk about the two cases. So to refer to the example of the killer, Singer uses the example of like a shooter, a person who would shoot and kill people. We've had too many cases like that, so I think you can understand the case or the example. So suppose that a person is, bent on destruction and they just want to go to a place and kill people. What's their motive? I mean, it's right there. It's just kind of self-explanatory, right? If a person's desire is to take lives, then that's their motive, to be the cause of people's lives ending. They want people to die, but they don't want them to die of natural causes. They want to be the cause, which is a horrible thing. So that's a very bad and evil motive, isn't it? To be a person who wants to be an agent of death, a person that wants to cause death. Now, let's switch the example to us. When you or I decline to give money to, let's say, an aid or a charity organization to help the poor, and instead we just spend it on ourselves, what's our motive? Is it to hurt people? Tell me that. What do you think is the motive of you or me when we go and we buy something nice for ourselves instead of giving it away to help the poor? Is it to hurt people? Is it the same motive the killer has? It's not, but what is the motive? When you go and you, let's say, buy a nice dinner, or you buy an expensive watch, and you already have like a couple of them, you call it self-care. I know this is like such a popular phrase nowadays, right? Treat yourself. But spoken of in more general terms, you're doing it because you just want to enjoy yourself, right? You're doing it to give yourself a treat, to make yourself happy. That is not the same thing as desiring or wishing harm on other people. So here's one point of difference. Can we all see that? The killer's motivation is evil and horrible. It's a desire to kill. The motive of the one that fails to assist is not to harm anybody. Wouldn't that be a weird person? I guarantee you no one's ever had this thought. They're sitting there, they buy their new Rolex, and they're like, sweet, how many poor people are going to starve because I didn't give $10,000 to them? That's the real reason I wanted the watch, just to think about all the dead people that didn't get the money. No, like nobody's thinking that. You're just thinking, I want the watch, it'll be cool to have it, I'm going to enjoy it. So you're just thinking of your own self-interest and your own happiness. So that's a different motive, not the same motive. Okay, now another difference between killing and failing to assist. This one's a little dark humor, but I almost think there's something kind of interesting and funny about it. So the second one, it's not hard to avoid killing, but it's very hard to save all the people whose lives that you could possibly save. Okay, so not hard to avoid killing, but very hard to save all the lives that you can. So here's another, fair difference between killing and failing to assist. If I'm being told, here are two moral obligations that are being compared with each other. Number one, don't kill people. Number two, do assist people. You could argue they're not at all equivalent in terms of those obligations, because the one obligation, don't kill, that is super easy to live up to. But the other one, which says go out and save lives by giving money or something, that's not easy to live up to. Okay, so let me ask you this. I'm going to make an assumption about everybody here in this chat that I guess I can't say I know 100%, but it's probably true, that none of us at all have ever killed another human being. Okay, so pretend you've never killed a person. I'm sure you have not. If you have not, then has it been hard for you to this point to not kill people? Like, how hard is it to not kill people? It's not hard at all. Yeah, for sure. But Red Panda, you know what I'm asking? What do you have to do to not kill people? What does that require? What do you have? What does it take to not? What do you have to do to not kill people? Literally nothing. You just have to mind your own business and leave people alone. That's all you got to do. So not killing people is as easy as just sitting down and minding your own business. So it's literally doing nothing. How many people are you not killing right now? All of them, billions of them. Okay, so not killing people, done, easy. But what does it take to save lives by means of assistance? Does that require you to just leave people alone and mind your own business? No. That requires not that you do nothing, but that you do something, and maybe a lot of somethings over a long period of time. Maybe that requires that you give money, give time, volunteer, and do it in a sustained way. So you could argue that the two obligations should not be compared, because one is trivial and very easy to do, not kill. On the other hand, assistance is not a mere matter of refraining from doing anything. It requires action. The other one requires inaction. So that's another way of looking at them being different. Okay, now next up, certainty of the outcome. Difference of certainty of the outcome. All right, so on this point, the idea is that in comparison between failing to assist and setting forth with the intent to kill people, it's a lot likelier in the case of the killer that some people are going to die or be hurt. But if you don't give money or aid, it's much less certain that that's really going to result in anybody being harmed. Okay, so like, for example, he gives a case of the shooter, and this is like such a weird, disturbing thing, but it's true. It's sort of sad but true. But if somebody really had that will and that intention to go and kill people with like a high-powered weapon, what do you think would be the percentage chance that they could successfully do it? Like if a person had the goal and the motive of doing that, don't you figure that it would be pretty likely? It surely would. It's sad to say. It's sort of like we're at the mercy of these psychopaths. Like, are they going to let me live today? I hope, but if they don't want to, it's not much I can really do, because a person with like that kind of weapon in a public place, they've always got the element of surprise. Maybe they've been plotting the thing out for a while, and then by the time they start popping off shots in a public place, no one has time to react, right? So it's sad, but because of the easy availability of those kinds of weapons and stuff, it's almost like dead certain that somebody's going to get hurt or very well killed if a person wants to do that. So we just got to hope people don't want to, and I hope that is the general case. Now, on the other hand, though, if you pass by the charity bucket and you don't give any money, you could think this thought, and it might not be unreasonable. You could say, well, you know, even if I gave money, though, maybe nothing good would happen. Maybe the aid agency would squander my money or waste it on overhead costs, right? Maybe it would get diverted to some kind of initiative that ended up either committing fraud or even just wasting the money on a project that didn't really help anybody. Like they build a well in some community in the third world, but there's actually nobody there to use it. So you could always be skeptical of the effectiveness of the aid, even if you did give it. So what I'm saying is that there's room for doubt as to whether failure to aid is really going to change things much. But a one person that wants to kill, on the other hand, it's much more lethal and certain to harm. So there's that difference. The outcome of people being hurt is very certain when a person is intentionally going to try and do it. But it's not as certain if a person just withholds on aid. Maybe that won't even lead to much harm. Okay. Now, fourth difference is the point he makes about identifiability of the victim. Identifiability of the victim. So again, to the example of the shooter that the author uses, if a person did that and they engaged in that kind of activity, then they're going to have victims. And these victims, of course, are going to be specific people whose identities are clearly easy to establish. But if you fail to give aid, right? First of all, we already said, who knows if it's really going to hurt anybody that when you fail to aid. But let's suppose that it does. Suppose that you didn't give money, and somehow, somewhere in the world, like a starving person in the third world died on that day. Is there any way that we can link those two things? Can we say, hey, you specifically, by not putting little money in that bucket, you're the cause of this specific person's death? You see, it doesn't work like that. We can't claim of your inaction that it produced a precise victim. But when one acts to kill, then definitely it's directly their fault that the person's dead, and they bear total responsibility for it. So you can argue that the killer has victims that are identifiable and who we know are the result of the killer's action. But the one that fails to assist, we can't associate that individual failure to donate with any particular person's death. Now, sometimes aid organizations will play on our sympathies and say, here's the footage or video or photo of a starving child. If you gave $5, this kind of child is going to survive. But it's not like it's earmarked for one particular person. It goes into a joint fund, and the administrators of the aid agency will spend it according to the priorities of the aid agency and what they're doing. So again, identifiable victims definitely with the shooter, but not so much with those that fail to assist. And then the final point, I guess I'll just erase the top because we've seen the header and I need that space. But the last difference that he mentions between killing and failing to assist is that you can always say of the poor that it's not my fault that they're poor, but no similar excuse could be given in the case of a killer. So that's another difference. You can always say, it's not my fault they're poor. Okay, so here's a trippy thought, maybe. I want you to imagine something, okay? Imagine this world, except you were never born, okay? I mean, it's lucky, and I'm glad you were born, but it might not have happened if parents never did meet or whatever. So can you imagine that? It's like this class is happening and all the other students are watching it, but you just don't exist. So imagine that counterfactual scenario. That's a hypothetical. You don't exist, you were never born. If you were never born, what do you think? Would the poor people of the third world still exist or not? That's an easy question. Just let me know what you think. If you had not been born in the first place, would they still be there? Yes, exactly, of course. It's no, there's nothing about you being born that caused that event or that status quo. It's not like when you were born, all the poor people emerged out of nowhere, and then your existence is the precondition for that to happen. So you could say, what does that mean? What that could mean to some people is, I was born into a world where there's a lot of poverty, but I'm not the reason that it happened, and I'm only really responsible or accountable for problems that I cause. If I kill people, yes, you have to hold me accountable and prosecute me, and that's what I deserve. But if there are people that are already starving, and I'm just born into the world where they're starving, I can't be blamed for that because it's really not my fault. I didn't make them poor, and it's maybe sad that they are, but I should only be accountable and responsible for problems that I am the cause of. And here's a problem that it is a problem, but I'm not the result, I'm not the cause of it. So those are 5 differences between killing and failing to assist. But Peter Singer is not done yet. The reason he brought these up, let's kind of take a step back. He's the guy who says we do have an obligation to assist the poor. So don't think that he's just changed his mind here and he's saying, never mind, there's a big difference between that and anything like killing. What he's now going to return to are these 5 points, and he's going to try and show to the reader that although many of these points are valid, they still don't take away all the blame from failing to assist. So maybe he's willing to say this, killing, okay, sure, it is worse. It's worse than failing to assist. That's fair. But when you really look at it, there's still something significantly wrong nonetheless about the failure to assist. We can't take all blame away just because something else is worse than that. Okay, so how does he report back on all of these and kind of push back? So what he says is, let's talk about lack of identifiable victim, this one. So he says when you do something that exposes people to additional risk, that's bad, even if we don't know who has been harmed by your risky behavior, okay? So like, say that you walk around, you got like a cough or something, and you just don't like masks or whatever. So you say, because of the discomfort of masks, even though I have a few little cold symptoms, I'm gonna walk around in public in crowded places and just let them deal with me, okay? Now when you do that, you might be causing other people around you to get sick with whatever you've got. If you had coronavirus, then you might be causing people to get sick or even die, right? Now, is there any way that any of the people who get infected are gonna be able to say, hey, it was him? I mean, we talk about contact tracing, right? But for the most part, the status of that is very imprecise. And it'd be hard to link any individual person's illness, death, or whatever to the one irresponsible person's choice to walk around with no mask on. But does that mean they did nothing wrong because we can't say exactly who it was? No, it's still wrong. It's wrong even if we can't tell you, oh, here's the one person that you made sick, and we know it for 100% fact. It's still wrong because you're adding additional risk to the situation, which makes it wrong even if we can't say who has been harmed by it. Now that's my example, which I think is more current and relevant. He gives this very weird hypothetical there. He's like, suppose that there was a guy who sold some consumable product, and the product has a decent percentage chance of giving someone stomach cancer down the line, but he doesn't tell them that. It just doubles the risk. So then like later, people who had stomach cancer learned that this was some exposure of risk from the product that they consumed, and they come to the vendor and they say, well, you know, it's your fault. Imagine that he tries to excuse himself by saying, yeah, you got stomach cancer, I'm sorry for that, but my product, it doesn't guarantee that you'll get it, it just ratchets up the risk to twice. So if you had a 10% risk, now you got a 20% risk. How do you know that it came from me? Maybe it came from your genetics, maybe it came from a different environmental exposure. Wouldn't it still be wrong though that he's made the person face this risk? Even if we can't say 100% certainty that that's his victim. I like the example I gave maybe a little better, but I'm just helping you know what the book said in that case. Same kind of features in both examples. Maybe one's a little more easy to understand. Okay, so that's what he says about identifiability of the victim. Again, the takeaway is maybe you can't precisely identify the victim of failure to assist, like I'm speaking of in these other examples, but it still was wrong because of the fact that you made a little more risk in the world for some people, known or unknown. Okay, now to the next point, lack of certainty of the outcome. The lack of certainty of the outcome. This one, he uses an example of a drunk driver, okay? So I want you to take two cases, a drunk driver and a homicidal driver. Okay, so what's the drunk driver doing? They're trying to just get home, but they're too drunk, so it's probably not safe, and it's a dangerous thing for them to be behind the wheel. But compare that to a guy who's behind the wheel who's trying to drive into people in a public place. Sadly, that has happened. It's happened in terrorist attacks. It's happened even in LA at the farmers market of Santa Monica and over on the Venice Beach Boardwalk. It happened there. Anyway, so which of the two cases do you think is likelier to lead to either death or injury? The drunk driver or the homicidal driver? Which of those two do you think has a greater certainty of negative outcome? I mean, neither thing is good, but what do you think is even more certain? The homicidal driver, right? Because if they hit people, it won't be like unintentional. They're going to try to do it, so they're going to deploy skill and stuff to try and make it happen. Now, the drunk driver is trying not to hit people because obviously they don't want to face any kind of accountability for driving drunk, but they could do it. Now, look, just because the homicidal driver is likelier to hurt people than the reckless drunk driver, does that mean the drunk driver is doing nothing wrong? No, it's still wrong. It's wrong even though there's something else that's even likelier to cause harm and damage. Just because going behind that wheel makes it likelier that some people are going to get hurt, it's wrong even if maybe not as potentially certain to harm as the homicidal case would be. I mean, again, with the mask thing, if I want to walk around with no mask, I'm putting people at risk. And maybe is that as certain as if I was like going to go out with a gun and just try and shoot as many people as I could? Definitely that's going to be more likely to definitely hurt people and kill them. But that doesn't mean that when I engage in risky behavior that could lead to harm, that I'm doing something that's totally morally justified. So once again, the point is that though isn't perhaps the same certainty in the case of failure to assist as with trying to kill, it's still to some extent wrong because of the additional risk that it introduces to the world. Okay, now what about this part about, you can always say it's not my fault that they're poor. Well, he has a couple of pushback points on that. The first thing he says is it really not our fault, at least indirectly? Okay, because, right, like members of the first world, citizens like us, it's probably the thing that you might think, like, how can I be morally criticized for inequities that I did not cause to happen? But he makes the point that, according to some anyway, the reason that there is this inequitable distribution of wealth and resources around the planet has something to do with the colonial system of economic exploitation in the past. Now we are, as Americans, the continuing beneficiaries of some of that colonial economic and other exploitation. So if we reap the continued benefits of ill-gotten gains, then some people might argue that we still bear some type of historical burden to try and redress the wrongs, even though many would argue this is not fair because it's like visiting the sins of the father upon the son. So he says, okay, if that's your take and I have no even indirect responsibility for the inequitable global situation we find ourselves in, then he has a second appeal to you, and that is just utilitarianism. He says if you're a utilitarian, you always have a standing obligation to try and do whatever it is that's going to generate the most overall utility or happiness, not merely to try and correct situations which you have in some way caused to be problematic. So like if you're a utilitarian and you're walking past a burning building that people are screaming, hey, just prop the door open, you'll be totally safe and then we can run out, but we can't do it from our side. The utilitarian can't look at that and be like, well, I'm not the arsonist, I didn't set the house on fire, so I mean, that's not my problem, I didn't cause the problem, you deal with your own thing. If you're a utilitarian, saving the lives is what you're morally obligated to do, even if you didn't cause the problem, because you're in a position to save the lives. And if you do that, it's going to maximize overall happiness compared to letting them die. So in the same way, a utilitarian might say, look, okay, do you think you're not responsible for those things even in any way? Okay, if that's how you feel, then you should still be motivated to try and improve on a situation, even if it's not your fault. Because the utilitarian doesn't worry about, is it my fault or not, when they want to try and go in and take actions that generate the most overall happiness. Okay, now, different motivation. With regards to that one, he goes back to the case of the drunk driver versus the homicidal driver. What's the motivation of the drunk driver? Is it to kill people? No. The homicidal driver, we already know. They want to kill people. That's their motivation. But what's the motivation of the drunk driver? To cause death or injury? What is their motive? It's not like the killer driver, is it? It's just to get home under their own power without having to ask a ride or call up a cab or another ride share type service. They don't want to have to stay over at the place, right? So they're just doing it of their own self-interest, but it's not the same as wanting to hurt people. So it's not the same evil motive, is it? But again, here's Singer telling you that doesn't erase all the wrong. You don't have to be motivated by harm to take actions that you know full well are risky and inviting risk to other people. So yes, we can say that the homicidal driver has a much more evil and worse motivation and that's a worse thing to do. But the drunk driver doesn't get off the hook of blame morally just because they're not motivated by harm. They're still taking actions that are negligent of other people's well-being and taking risks with those other people's well-being. So in the same way, you could say that when you fail to assist the poor, you contribute additional risk to those that might have otherwise been helped by the assistance that you could have given. And though you're not motivated by their harm or injury or death, you're still doing something that places them at greater risk and is therefore still somewhat wrong. Finally, on the point that it's not hard to avoid killing, but it's real hard to save all the lives that you ever could, Singer says that in a way misconstrues what I'm arguing, because he says, I'm not actually saying that you have to devote all your time and money in a never-ending, non-stop, all-out effort to save all the poor people that you could ever save. Instead, he thinks we should be trying at least to do more than absolutely nothing. And viewed from that point of view, just do something instead of nothing, it's maybe not so hard to live up to the obligation. So having then settled these points, he returns to his basic claim that we do have a moral obligation to assist the poor, notwithstanding the fact that it's not exactly comparable to killing. but it's still in some level of moral blameworthiness, short of killing perhaps. Now, there's a little more actually in Singer's article, but we've gotten through like a good big part of it. So on Tuesday when we resume, I'll finish up this Singer, and then we'll talk about the other side of the argument, which is Garrett Hardin. Garrett Hardin, you'll see, has just a radically different opinion on this, and he makes the case against helping the poor. So we have to learn about his ideas in comparison with Singer. Then we'll move on to another couple of authors, or one more author really, before we start getting ready for our midterm. Midterm is Tuesday of week 9. This is week 6, Thursday, so it's 2 weeks from upcoming meeting on Tuesday. I'll provide you guys with a study guide for the midterm sometime next week so you can start looking at the topics and questions. And I'll be grading all your essays as I've been doing through next week, so they'll be ready well in advance of the midterm. And you'll be able to get your scores or any comments when I'm done within the next week or so. Okay, so I guess we're all good, everybody. Are you good to go? Hope you had a good day and the lecture wasn't too bad. Thanks again for your time and for all of your attention. And I'll definitely just see you guys after the weekend then, okay? So have a great weekend, and bye-bye for now. Thank you. What did I think about the debate? You're asking me, Ricardo? I kind of side more with Peter Singer if it was just me. I think the other guy's pretty harsh and uncharitable, but hey, it's an argument, and I just got to be neutral in a way. But my opinions, they are what they are. I kind of like the ideas and arguments of Singer. Maybe I don't agree with every point. Oh, presidential? Oh, those debates, ha. Yeah, it was a hot mess, wasn't it? Trump was going off. It was, I mean, kind of difficult to watch in some ways. I thought that Biden won. I'll just say that. But okay, guys, have a great night. Thank you so much again. Okay, bye-bye.